Well, good evening, London. Welcome to Piers Morgan Uncensored. 5 days ago, terrorists from Hamas attacked Israel. They murdered and raped civilians. They executed the elderly at bus stops. They took babies and Holocaust survivors as hostages. And they massacred young people at a festival. They may, it emerged last night, have even beheaded babies in one village. More than 1,200 Israelis are now believed to have died. And this brutal attack has dragged Israel into war. Israel had every right to respond with force, as it's done. The death toll in Gaza is now more than 1,000, and many more will die. Many of those will be completely innocent people, like those who died in the Hamas attacks. Like almost everyone, I've been shocked and sickened by the stories and videos emerging from the attack. I've also been stunned by the moral cowardice of those who celebrated terror as resistance and brutality as politics. I've called out the people who've conflated a terror attack with a geopolitical debate, and I've spoken to fair-minded people on both sides of that debate. I've done all this as a journalist and a human being, but with no personal skin in the game. My guest tonight, on the other hand, is one of the most prominent and influential Jewish commentators on the planet. Ben Shapiro has been visibly moved and enraged by the tragedies unfolding in Israel, and the world has paid attention to his analysis. Tonight I'm giving the show to him as we tackle all the big questions that have come out of this. What is a proportionate response to terrorism? Should the United States be more involved? How do we move forward if everyone involved sees the other side as an oppressor or a savage? And Daily Wire's Ben Shapiro joins me now. Ben, great to have you on the programme. I wish it was under different circumstances. I want to ask you, first of all, where were you when you first heard about these attacks?
So I'd been in Israel for several weeks, and we had just gotten home to the United States on Friday morning. Friday night, obviously, is Sabbath for Orthodox Jews, and it also happened to be one of the biggest celebratory days of the year. Shmini Atzeres Simchat Torah was a 2-day, what we call a Yom Tov, which means no electricity. Really, you can't use your phone, you can't use your computer. My security team showed up at synagogue on Saturday morning and started informing me of what had happened, and then news was kind of bleeding throughout the day. There were various sources, maids who were leaving TVs on, for example, or my security team informing me throughout the weekend of what exactly was happening because of the serious security concerns that arise for Jews all over the planet when there's mass terror attack in Israel or anywhere else. And so we were finding out in a lagged time what exactly was happening. Obviously, we couldn't watch the videos. We couldn't see exactly what was happening until it came back online on Sunday night, and we're hit with the news that at that point, 700 Jews have been murdered today. That number has been totaled at well over 1,200 Jews have been murdered in Israel. We started to see all of the pictures on our TVs. I obviously, because I'm in touch with a lot of people on the ground, first responders, people on the ground in Israel, I started receiving extraordinary levels of footage and video and audio and pictures of what exactly had happened in these places. And these are images. I've been trying to show them to the audience for one very specific reason. And that specific reason is to understand what evil is. You have to look in the face of evil. And I think that we in the West have a peculiar narcissism that everyone thinks like we do, that we value children in a certain way. And so everyone values children in a certain way. That if somebody does something truly terrible or evil, it must be that there was something that, quote unquote, drove them to, it must be a policy question. But as it turns out, that is not the case, because there's literally nothing, I think, Piers, that could drive people in the West, a normal person, to go and to murder a baby in their crib in a civilian area, to simply walk in and gun down grandmothers, or to rape a woman and drag her back to the Gaza Strip. What could drive you to do that? I can't think of anything that would drive me to do that, but there are a lot of people who are not only driven to do that, but believe full well in the virtue of what they're doing. That is a different mode of thought, and that is not something you can negotiate with.
You've seemed about this, for completely understandable reasons, to have been more enraged than I think I've ever seen you, almost like a simmering volcano as you've talked about this. I want to play a clip from your Daily Wire YouTube channel. You have 6 million subscribers, and this is part of what was, I thought, a very powerful address that you made there.
I am a Jew. Those have been the words of the Jewish people for 3 millennia. Those were the words of the men, women, and children of Masada. Those were the words of the followers of Bar Kokhba. Those were the words of Jews in Granada in 1066 and the Rhineland in 1096, and Khmelnytsky from 1648 to 1657, and Kishinev in 1903, and Hebron in 1929. Those were the words of Jews in Auschwitz and Treblinka. Those were the last words of Daniel Pearl. And those are my words too. They're the words of my parents. the words of my wife, my children. Over the weekend, my people, the Jewish people, were attacked and murdered, mutilated. Our women were raped. Our children were kidnapped. This has happened millions of times before to millions of Jews across history. Jew hatred exists because evil exists, because there are people who have, for literally all of human history, hated the Jews and sought to strike at them while they are weak, who have blamed the Jews for their own problems, who have crafted complex conspiracy theories about the supposed power of the Jews, who have sought to destroy, to murder, to mutilate, to rape the Jews, from Pharaoh to Haman, from Hitler to Hamas.
What reaction have you had to that, Ben?
I think the reaction has been pretty strong and overwhelmingly positive. I think there are a lot of people, not only Jews, mostly my audience is people who are not Jewish, obviously, who understand the history of the Jewish people, who understand what it means when the greatest slaughter of Jews on a mass scale happens since the Holocaust, and who understand that it is inextricably linked to a history of anti-Semitism that goes back thousands of years. I mean, this extermination level anti-Semitism, what you see from Hamas, it's literally part of their charter. And so the attempt to treat them as a normal political body obviously is foolish. I think that a lot of people resonated to that. It's certainly the strongest I felt about anything that had happened in my lifetime since 9/11, as an American, since 9/11. And as a Jew, obviously, I'm watching as people that I know, people I'm friends with, are getting called up to go to the military and serve in Gaza, try to protect the Israeli citizenry who are Jews and Arabs, who are Christians and Jews and Muslims. And I'm watching as there are people out there who are rallying on behalf of actual terrorist groups murdering children. I mean, it's an amazing, I would say, exposure of ignorance at best, and Jew hatred at worst.
Do you have any personal connection to anyone whose life was taken?
I don't. I'm lucky. I would say that I have. Certainly, I know a lot of people who do. So the way to talk about the Jewish community in general, there are not very many Jews on the planet. Due to conspiracy theories, people tend to think there are tens of millions of Jews on the planet. The grand total number of Jews on planet Earth is about 15 million. About 7 million who live in the state of Israel. There are about 6 million who live in the United States. And what that means is that in general society, you think, 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon. With 7 degrees of connection, you can find anyone. Among Jews, that's one. That number is one. So I certainly know an enormous number of people who have had people who are kidnapped, who've had people who are murdered. I certainly know personally an enormous number of people who are on the ground right now. I know Americans who are in Israel with me who decided to stay over the last day of the Yom Tov, over the holiday, and ended up basically getting stuck there because the airport was shut down because of rocket attacks. And when the call went out to everybody with medical training to show up to help, I know American doctors who showed up at the Gaza border to simply set up triage stations and help people out. So, I mean, it's a very small community. It's a very close-knit community, obviously.
You've spoken a lot about Hamas before, called them evil. You did a second video called Make God Avenge Their Blood, in which you said that Hamas, in some ways, they are worse than Nazis, which some viewed as a very provocative statement. Why did you say that about them?
The Nazis, I mean, here's a phrase I'll never use again, at least the Nazis. So at least the Nazis attempted to hide their crimes. So the Nazis obviously mechanized death. They had Einsatzgruppen units that drove up to Jewish villages and would mow people down. And then they would bury them, and then they would try to hide the crimes. And it took the Nuremberg team years to undig all of that material. In this particular case, you have Hamas terrorists who are murdering Jews in their beds and then live streaming it and celebrating it and bragging about it and talking about how incredible it is and blasting that sort of stuff out. I mean, the videos that I've been showing on my show, a lot of them are coming directly from Hamas. I mean, it's Hamas that is taking contemporaneous video of this sort of stuff. And that's a whole new level of evil. I mean, to celebrate this sort of stuff, to treat it as a triumph. I mean, I think the thing that people really have to realize here is this is not a military operation. This was not a military operation. I mean, people have compared this to, for example, the 1973 Yom Kippur War. That was an awful moment in Israel's history when it was taken by surprise by the combined Arab armies around it. But that was a military operation with a military objective, which was to seize territory. This is not a military operation with a military objective. This was an operation directed specifically at civilians. And when we see death in Gaza, which we're going to see, and the images are going to be horrifying and terrible, it is important to understand that the reason that is happening is not just because Hamas crossed the border and murdered a bunch of civilians in their beds, but also because Hamas literally hides its weaponry behind civilians. Israel is currently, right now, sending out messages to Gazan civilians, telling them to get out of particular areas. And Hamas is sending out full-scale messages telling people to ignore those messages and to stay where they are. Now, Hamas is there's a reason why their headquarters were for years located underneath a hospital. I mean, it's what they understand that the West, again, has a peculiar narcissism where we think we would never put our military hardware below a hospital. That'd be insane. And so if Israel blows up a hospital, it must be that Israel's doing that because they're targeting civilians. Hamas knows that. That's why they're doing it. That's why they're doing it. They literally hide their rocket launchers behind apartment buildings in the hope that Israel will strike back and have to kill civilians in the process. Israel cares significantly more about civilian casualties in Gaza than Hamas ever has.
There have been so many horrendous images and videos. The poor girl from the music festival taken away on the motorbike was just bone-chilling to watch. I saw something on CNN yesterday with Jake Tapper where he's interviewing the relative of his grandmother, who was murdered, and Hamas posted the video of her being murdered onto her Facebook page so her family would watch it. I mean, when you hear that, it's sort of unconscionable. It's kind of beyond depravity. This is inhumanity.
I mean, Piers, you're in the business of words and I'm in the business of words, and I've found myself repeatedly over the last few days unable to find words to describe the kind of thing that we're seeing. And again, we stretch, I think, in the West, and I stretch as an American. I think we all stretch to try and find, what would drive somebody to do something like this. And the answer sometimes is that they're I don't know how to say this otherwise. They are not like you. Hamas is not like you. They don't think like you. They don't have the same priorities as you. They don't have the same values as you. And that means that any attempt to buy them off is bound to fail. And this is inextricably intertwined with the history. I mean, the fact is, Israel turned over the Gaza Strip in 2005. There were no Jews living in the Gaza Strip since 2005. The areas that were attacked in this particular terrorist attack are not areas that are in the so-called settlements, the Shtachim, in Judea, Samaria, what's called the West Bank. That's not the area that was attacked. The area that was attacked has been sovereign Israeli territory since 1947-48. And that territory was attacked from across a border that is entirely controlled by Hamas, which has utilized pretty much every dollar that has flooded into that region over the course of 20 years from America, from Europe, taxpayer dollars that have been used to build up these terror capabilities. Every time there are cement shipments into the area ruled by Hamas, Hamas has used it to build terror tunnels. Pipes that have been sent into the area ruled by Hamas that were meant to build sewage systems have been repurposed and used for rocket tubes. I mean, it's utterly insane. And to try and come up with some sort of territorial solution, this is really just a territorial dispute. It is not a territorial dispute. It is a genocidal group that makes clear its own intention. I don't know how many times people have to tell you who they are before we believe them. The reason that I've been saying that Hamas is genocidal for literally my entire career is because they say in their own founding documents that they are genocidal. It's not as though they're attempting to avoid culpability or responsibility for this. They are saying it out loud. They're begging you to take them seriously.
Well, they're also terrorists. I mean, let's just be crystal clear. This is an act of terrorism that we saw at the weekend, the worst since 9/11, one of the worst terror attacks in modern history. And yet you have mainstream media, the BBC in Britain, refusing to describe Hamas as terrorists. They call them militants. Even John Simpson, one of their senior foreign correspondents and editors, said it's not a journalist's role to call groups like Hamas terrorists. He says calling someone a terrorist means you're taking sides and ceasing to treat the situation with due impartiality. The BBC's job is to place the facts before its audience and let them decide what they think honestly and without ranting. That's why in Britain and throughout the world, nearly 500 million watch, listen to, and read us. There's always someone who'd like us to rant. Sorry, it's not what we do, but I don't think it's about ranting to describe acts of terror as being committed by terrorists. And the New York Times apparently today actually changed the wording of a story they put online and changed the word Hamas terrorists to Hamas gunmen, as if they're almost terrified, literally, I mean, how ironic, of using the word terrorist. But what is it about mainstream media, two huge examples of it, New York Times and the BBC, that they won't just call this what it is?
I think that a lot of these groups are afraid of the political implications of just calling a terrorist. I mean, when you acknowledge that the government of the Gaza Strip is in fact a terrorist government, that has some pretty large-scale implications for a lot of the political agendas at play. Because, of course, the great sort of dream of the West since at least the Oslo Accords has been that territorial concessions and that economic concessions would solve this problem. And when it turns out that an entire area is governed by a government that is in fact a terrorist government, is an actual terrorist group, then that has some pretty significant implications moving forward for the prospects in the region. And it also suggests that Israel has a moral duty, which it absolutely does, to protect its own citizenry by eviscerating that terrorist group from the planet. And the word terrorist has a definition. And that definition, by any stretch of the imagination, is fulfilled by what Hamas is. I mean, the BBC's explanation is so bizarre. It's almost like suggesting that if you found a man who had murdered his wife in an apartment and you reported on that, you didn't call it murder. You just said that someone was killed. A person was killed, and the person was convicted of murder, and you still said they're not a murder. We don't make judgments over here and use language like the word murderer because that would carry some moral implication. Well, yes, it turns out that murdering entire families, slaughtering entire families, burning them. I mean, some of the stuff that I've been tweeting out, which is stuff I'm getting again directly from first responders on the ground. I mean, just a few moments ago, I tweeted out, I wish I didn't have to tweet out these photos, but I think people need to understand the consequences of failing to see evil for what it is. It was a photo of a group of people in a kibbutz called Kibbutz Be'eri, which is again near the border where 100 bodies were found. And they were attempting to simply escape, and Hamas stopped the car and burned these people alive. I mean, I don't know how you don't call that. What other goal could you have but to obscure the morality of the situation if you refuse to call things what they are? It boggles the mind. It truly does.
I mean, what also boggled the mind for me was Black Lives Matter Chicago, which had a Twitter account with 60,000 followers. They actually posted a caricature image of a paraglider saying, "I stand with Palestine." The paragliders, of course, were the ones who flew in and killed all the people at the music festival. What did you feel when you saw that?
I mean, unsurprising, only in the sense that Black Lives Matter as an organization had all sorts of solidarity statements about Palestine going all the way back to the original movement in 2014, 2015. But seeing them actively take up the imagery of an actual terrorist attack, that's what that is. Palestinians are not famous for their hang gliding. I mean, the only reason why that is the image is because literal terrorists use paragliders in order to murder civilians at an electronic dance music festival, by the way, attended mostly by people of the political left. I mean, those are not right-wing Israelis who are dancing at an EDM festival on a Saturday. That's not the way that works. It's only astonishing in either the moral blindness or the anti-Semitism. And at a certain point, the moral blindness becomes the anti-Semitism, because when you are celebrating active Jew murder and you are saying that that's solidarity, that's a pretty incredible thing. I'd also like to point out here that the argument in favor of Palestinian self-determination did not need to be threatened by any of these people. All they could have said is, Hamas does not represent Palestinians. This does not have any implications for Palestinian self-determination. Hamas is a terrorist group, and they ought to be eviscerated, and they ought to be replaced by a better government that could make peace. Like, none of this is particularly hard. The fact that they're lumping together Hamas with the Palestinian cause says an awful lot, and it doesn't say anything good.
In one of the videos, you say the only solution is for Israel to annex the Gaza Strip and kill enough sons of bitches to make sure this isn't a problem again. You say anyone who calls for a ceasefire is a terrorist sympathizer under these circumstances. Now, that got a lot of pushback. I guess this comes to the point of appropriate response. How far do you go? How do you isolate genuine Hamas from perhaps completely innocent Palestinians in Gaza, of which there will be many? One person called you a genocidal warmonger for that rhetoric. And there's a person called Muhammad Hijab in a video called in responding to Ben Shapiro on Israel. He says this.
First and foremost, I'll say, yes, we condemn any woman, child, or whatever it may be that's being killed who's Jewish and who's not a non-combatant. But why is it the case, Ben? Why is it the case that none of your colleagues or you have been able to offer one single condolence, one single condemnation, one single word of sympathy for any of the Gazans that have been killed? Don't try and smear us. Don't try and slander us. Don't try and attack. Don't try and produce red herrings. And I think you're an ass, a jackass. And we're not talking about Hamas. We're talking about children here. We're talking about women here. We're talking about elderly people. You make me sick. You make me sick.
What's your response to that, Ben? I mean, that will be, I'm sure, a reaction you've heard from a lot of people. What do you feel about that?
I mean, my obvious response is, of course, I feel horrible for the people who are being held by Hamas in a state of tyranny for the past 15 years. Hamas was the elected government in Gaza in 2006. There hasn't been an election since then. All the people who are today ranting, as you heard Muhammad Hijab doing right there, I don't hear them talking about liberating Gaza from Hamas, which is the greatest threat to the way of life of Gazans on planet Earth. Again, I have nothing but sympathy for Hamas, for the people that Hamas is governing, or the people that Hamas is exploiting, really. I have nothing but sympathy for civilians there. Israel has to defend itself. I don't understand exactly what the expectation would be here. Is the expectation that because Hamas uses human shields, that Israel therefore has to go home and wait to have its people murdered again? Israel tried it the way that Muhammad Hijab and others would like. Israel literally pulled, in 2005, they literally pulled thousands of Jews out of the Gaza Strip. It was called the disengagement, and it was massively unpopular in wide swaths of Israel. They pulled out, they built a wall, and they basically said, go ahead and govern yourselves. And this is the result of that. You think Israel, you think anyone in Israel, no one in Israel wants to reoccupy the Gaza Strip. No one. That's why Israel has been studiously avoiding reoccupying the Gaza Strip since 2006, despite the fact that they have been living underground in large parts of Israel for weeks at a time because of rocket attacks that have been fired on a regular basis from the Gaza Strip into major cities.
But let me ask you this, Ben.
Ashkelon.
In Gaza, you have 2 million people, many of whom are young people. Pretty hopeless conditions to live in. I think people would agree with that. Not much chance of getting out of there. They live in very densely populated areas. We know from in the last 24 hours that Israel controls water, controls energy, power going in there. Many would see that that is a control that Israel shouldn't have if you want to afford equal rights to people living in Gaza. And then it comes down to proportionate response and how you try and, like I say, how do you attack Hamas, given they're all over Gaza, living amongst the general population? How do you attack and isolate genuine members of Hamas, genuine terrorists, from the civilian population? And given that is almost impossible, clearly, what is a proportionate response to what's happened here?
Well, frankly, I don't believe in proportionate response to terrorism. I believe that the way that you stop terrorism is with wildly disproportionate response. That doesn't mean in terms of targeting civilians. It means in terms of killing as many terrorists as humanly possible and allowing them to dictate the terms of engagement by hiding behind civilians in areas that they are supposedly responsible for, means that the only option for Israel is to surrender to Hamas's hatred of its own citizens, its willingness to use its own children as human shields. No country worth its salt could ever do that. No government trying to protect its own citizens could ever do that. What exactly is the alternative option other than for Israel to try to kill as many of these terrorists and depose Hamas and hopefully help put in place some sort of international overseen community that would actually govern the Gaza Strip in a rational, reasonable way that actually maximizes the possibilities of its citizens? Israel, over the course of the last year, allowed some 15,000 work permits to Gazans. Many of those work permits, we're now finding out, were used by terrorists in order to cross the border. The fact that Israel controls the water and the power, the reason that Israel controls the water and the power is specifically because if they did not control the water and the power, Hamas would be right now holed up with the water and the power indefinitely. I mean, the fact is that the reason that Israel controls, for example, the sea border is because if they did not, there were attempts to ship weapons in from Turkey multiple times. The impossible situation in which Israel finds itself with regard to the Gaza Strip is mirrored only by the impossible situation in which Gazan civilians find themselves. And all of that, every single iota of that, is the result of Hamas, which means unless there is a change in status, in which Hamas is removed from power, in which someone else is put in charge, this is going to continue. Again,
but I would argue
10,000 Jews want to die going into the Gaza Strip in order to defend their citizens?
I agree with you, but I would also say that I think that it would also benefit any chance of a peace settlement that if Netanyahu wasn't in charge anymore. I mean, apart from anything else, this is an unbelievable breach and failure of security and military. I think part of that can be apportioned to the extraordinary social unrest that's been enveloping Israel since his cabinet, full of a lot of right-wing headbangers, frankly, some of whom have actually called themselves fascists, have tried to take on the judiciary and the Supreme Court. I don't feel comfortable about that. What do you feel about that? And do you feel that Netanyahu is the right person? Does it need a completely clean leadership now, both in Palestine and Israel, to try and get to somewhere approaching peace?
The democratically elected government of Israel has not had a change in policy, despite the fact that until very recently, Netanyahu was not the prime minister of Israel. It was a joint government run by Naftali Bennett, as well as by Yair Lapid, who's a member of the hard left who dramatically opposes Benjamin Netanyahu. Today, they formed a unity government between Benny Gantz, who's a member of the center left, and Benjamin Netanyahu, who's a member of the center right, Likud party in Israel. This is not, when it comes to foreign policy, the reality is that since the rejection of any peace deal by Mahmoud Abbas in 2009, when Ehud Olmert was the prime minister of Israel. There's been very little disagreement between any of the parties with regard to foreign policy because they do not have a peace partner. The Oslo process was killed by the Palestinians, and it was killed by the Palestinians when they rejected multiple peace offerings by Ehud Barak, by Ariel Sharon, by Ehud Olmert, over and over and over again, by Yitzhak Rabin, by Shimon Peres. Benjamin Netanyahu himself, in the Wye River Accords of 1998, handed over significant portions of the West Bank to the Palestinians. So you can say that Netanyahu's a problem. That's fine. But the reality
I was
is
really
that
asking you whether I was asking you whether you feel he is a problem, that actually all the division that's been caused by his attempt to usurp the power of the Supreme Court, as many people see it, all that division in Israel has actually diminished his authority, and that it's come at a time when you really need somebody with real authority.
Well, I mean, I don't think that right now that's really the question, considering, again, it's a unity government, and I'm talking to everybody in Israel, and all of those divisions heal up in a moment when your children are being slaughtered at the border, as it turns out. So, all of the judicial reform conversation is a separate conversation. We can critique how fast they went in terms of this coalition. They went too fast. They scaled it back. There were serious divisions in Israeli society about what kind of power the judiciary ought to have. There are many people on both sides, actually, who believe the judiciary had too much power. There are a lot of people on both sides who believe the government went too fast on that. Internal political divisions have become completely irrelevant here. If Netanyahu were replaced tomorrow by Benny Gantz, which is what a lot of Israelis would hope for, if that were to happen literally tomorrow, nothing would change. Nothing would change. And the reason nothing would change is because, again, this is an issue. This particular issue is about Hamas. This has nothing to do with the constituency of the Israeli government. You could find the most left-wing person in Israeli politics right now, which would be Yair Lapid. You could put him back in the prime minister seat, and he would be forced with exactly the same decisions that Netanyahu is faced with right now.
How do you see it? Take me forward 20 years. In a dream scenario, how does the region look?
In a dream scenario, economic development, which I think is what the Abraham Accords were about and what the burgeoning Saudi peace deal was about. And by the way, the burgeoning Saudi peace deal is the reason that Hamas did this at the behest of Iran. They were afraid of a regional realignment that would create a Sunni-Jewish alliance, right, oriented largely against the Shia power of Iran, which is spread through Lebanon, Syria, and now down into Hamasistan. The economic development is the only way to move forward for the region. That was the premise of the Abraham Accords. Again, it was the premise of the nascent Saudi peace deal. Israel would love to do that with the Palestinian Authority. They would love to do that with anyone governing the Palestinians, to provide better economic conditions. I mean, one of the great ironies of all this is that 20% of Israel's population is Arab. The Arabs in Israel earn a far better income. They have far better GDP per capita than Arabs who are living under the Palestinian Authority or under the Gaza or under Hamas. And when you take polls of Israeli Arabs, many of whom are not particularly fond of the state of Israel, almost zero of them wish to actually relocate to any of these areas because economic development is economic development. The way out of this is that, but in order for that to happen, the people on the other side of the table have to actually agree that economic development is a worthwhile thing, is an end goal. And this goes back to the original point that I was making, is that we in the West, we believe that economic development worthwhile, that what we are all seeking is the same sort of peaceful, decent life where we leave each other alone and get to live our lives. I think that we all agree on that. But there's a group of people who absolutely do not agree with that, and they don't care about the level of economic development. They would rather live. I mean, Hamas would rather that its own citizens live in poverty and penury and orient themselves against the extermination of the Jews than that economic development even be allowed to take place. I mean, I know everyone in the Israeli government, I promise you, everyone in the Israeli government, right to left, would love nothing better than economic development of the people surrounding them so they don't have to send their sons and daughters to go fight and die in Gaza.
Do you believe in the concept of a two-state solution?
I mean, if there were a party on the other side to negotiate with, and if the possibility of a two-state solution was real, sure. I mean, but the question is, how realistic is that? Negotiations cannot be the cure-all. You have to have a partner on the other side of the table. The entire premise of the Oslo Accords is that you could take an actual terrorist by the name of Yasser Arafat. You could negotiate with him. You could make a deal with him, and this would magically cure the situation. Well, a deal is not capable of being cut with literally anyone. That's not the way any of this works. So in order for there to be any sort of long-term peace, including a Palestinian state, there would have to be a complete difference in leadership in these areas. And that would actually require Palestinian moderates to take the floor. The Palestinian Authority is not a moderate group. Islamic Jihad is a terrorist group. Hamas is a terrorist group. And until that changes, nothing's going to change. And by the way, there is the possibility of that change. If you had told me 10 years ago that there would be Saudi-Israeli normalization on the table, I would have laughed in your face. If you told me that Israel would have been able to cut peace deals with the UAE and with Morocco, I would have scoffed. And I think everyone would have scoffed. So there is that possibility. But
And
again,
I would also,
you cannot make peace with a side that wants to murder you. That is not a possibility.
Well, on that point, all I would say to that is I'm an Irish Catholic, and we had the Troubles in Northern Ireland. Different circumstances. I'm not going to try and equate the two. But there you had people on both sides trying to kill each other. You had the IRA trying to kill civilians indiscriminately to make their political points. And in the end, a peace deal was achieved, but it was achieved by people sitting down opposite people they knew had been killing civilians and killing people on their side. You even had the Queen meeting Martin McGuinness and Gerry Adams, who were in McGuinness's case, the former chief of staff of the IRA. He ordered some of the most appalling atrocities. The Queen, one of her own relatives, was blown to pieces, Lord Mountbatten, by the IRA, but she still met with them. I was actually at number 10 Downing Street when Tony Blair met McGuinness and Adams on the steps for the first time in 70 years as the members of Sinn Féin, and shook their hands. I was next in to see him in his office, and it was an extraordinary moment to watch. And it was a moment many people thought would never happen. Do you see any parallel there in terms of what could be achieved with Israel and Palestine?
Only if the leadership changes. Only if the leadership changes on the Palestinian side. That is the only way that happens. And again, the difference here is that the IRA had territorial ambitions. Hamas does not have territorial ambitions. They have genocidal ambitions. The Palestinian Authority has been offered multiple deals over multiple decades, and they've rejected, without counteroffers, virtually every deal they have ever been offered. Islamic Jihad is a terrorist group. Again, if the IRA was dedicated to the complete slaughter and eradication of every non-Irish Britisher in the UK, that would be the equivalent of Hamas. And that would not be a negotiating position because, again, could there be successful negotiations? It depends on the partner.
Right.
I mean, the example that you're using is the best example of sides that are incredibly far apart coming together. But here we are talking about one side that, simple premise, if Israel put down all of its guns tomorrow, every Jew in the region would be slaughtered. If Hamas put down all of its guns tomorrow, Israel would leave the Gaza Strip alone. It is that simple.
Let me ask you got into a Twitter spat with Andrew Tate yesterday. He's a converted Muslim. He'd been doing a lot of supportive tweets for the Palestinians. And he tweeted at you at one stage, "Mr. Tough Guy, let me assure you, as someone who's done his own fighting as opposed to excitedly encouraging others to do it for him while sitting at home on a comfy chair, peace is always worth a conversation." What was that spat about? Why did you engage with him? What do you feel about that?
Well, what I feel about that is that he was tweeting that immediately, like as terrorists were still running around in southern Israel. That was on October 10th. And he was still tweeting while the bodies were fresh and warm in the streets. Peace is, you cannot make peace with people who murdered your children and burned their bodies. You can't do that. I mean, this rush to Israel, the murder happens and you immediately say, okay, well, guys, now truce, now ceasefire. That is not, no state worth its salt. No government on earth would allow this kind of insanity. No government on earth. And no government on earth would listen to nonsense about how you immediately have to seek peace with a group that seeks your direct extermination. Again, I can't emphasize it enough. Israel turned over the Gaza Strip to Gazans in 2005. Hamas has governed the area since 2006. The year is currently 2023. Israel has endured round after round of rocket fire on its major cities for literally almost 20 years. And now the idea is the minute that Gazan terrorists rush through the border and murder people in their beds, that's the time for a peace conversation. That's the time for a peace conversation. By the way, and I'm not going to be lectured on morality and toughness by Andrew Tate, whose great idea of toughness and morality is pimping women and then bragging about it on air and trying to quasi-walk it back while simultaneously maintaining many of the same positions and flexing his biceps.
I mean, he's got a huge following, as you know, especially online. Is it dangerous? Is it reckless that he's able to tweet from house arrest still, of course, in Romania, that he can tweet on something like this and have the kind of influence that he has?
Listen, everyone should be able to tweet whatever it is that they want. I'm all for an open discourse, even with people who I think are dead wrong on a lot of these issues. But Andrew Tate is dead wrong on a lot of these issues. And the particularly ridiculous posturing about being you're very tough when you want people to make peace with terrorists who just murdered their children. Very, very tough.
You mentioned Iran earlier. President Biden yesterday came out, 10-minute speech, sounded very tough and very supportive of Israel, but never once mentioned Iran. Was that a failure by him, or are they waiting to establish concrete evidence of Iran's involvement?
So I think there's a good reason he could have done that and a bad reason that he could have done that. And the bad reason is pretty obvious, which is that the United States has unfrozen $6 billion in assets to flood into Iran in return for hostages. That money is fungible. And there's every possibility that money flowing into Iran since the weakening of sanctions has contributed to Iran's spread of terror. That is not only a possibility, that's a probability, and everyone knows it. So if you avoid mentioning Iran, then presumably it avoids blowback. That is the bad reason. The good reason might be that the United States wants to take down the temperature in the region. So right now, geopolitically, this is a contained conflict. This is Israel versus Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and everyone of good heart on every side should hope that it remains that way. If Hezbollah, which is on Israel's northern border and is an Iranian client, Hezbollah is a massive and significantly more powerful than Hamas terrorist group that exists and has say in the government of Lebanon. Again, Israel is surrounded on a lot of sides by terrorist groups that masquerade as government. Hezbollah has about 150,000 much more sophisticated rockets than Hamas pointed at northern Israel. Everyone understands that if Hezbollah, which would only do this at the behest of Iran, if Hezbollah were to get in, Israel would then be stretched militarily to the point where they would not have any choice but to go full force. And what that means is that all of the talk right now about the supposed disproportionate force that Israel is using in the Gaza Strip, talk with which I wildly disagree, that will all go out the window, because once you are stretched to the point of extermination, all bets are off, and the Israeli Air Force will have to be unleashed on the southern border of Lebanon. At that point, you would have to imagine that Bashar Assad in Syria starts to get active, Iran starts to get active. So one of the things that the possible good reason why he didn't mention Iran is because he's attempting to keep Iran out of the war. That basically the idea would be, he did say in the speech that any other group that wants to get in, don't. America, to its great credit, to our great credit, we've stationed a battle carrier, an aircraft carrier outside of Lebanon in the Mediterranean, and basically said to Hezbollah that they should not get in. That is, in fact, the best available move. So again, there's a very plausible bad reason why he didn't mention Iran, which is to avoid the blowback from his own idiotic Iran policy. And there's a possible good reason, which is that he's attempting to avoid the broadening of the conflict.
Donald Trump says, as he's wont to do with these crises, that it would never have happened if he was president. Do you think that may have some truth?
I think there's some truth to that, for sure. I think that Iran has seen weakness. Iran saw an opportunity to prevent the Saudis from coming into the Abraham Accords, and they thought that they could push where they saw mush. I mean, the withdrawal from Afghanistan made America look weak. The continuous dealings between the United States and Iran, despite Iran's openly genocidal intentions with regard to Israel, has made America look weak. The fact that Robert Malley, who is one of the chief negotiators for the United States, was apparently co-opted by Iranian intelligence groups, makes the Americans look particularly weak. And so appearances of weakness in the Middle East matter an awful lot. It is not politics in Western states, where we try to negotiate, we try to have discussions. That is not how politics works in the Middle East. It is a place where strength is really the only coin of the realm.
There is a theory that Hamas have done this spectacularly awful act of terrorism deliberately on a scale that would goad Israel into overreacting and spark a much wider war.
I mean, I think that there's probably truth to that. I think that Hamas, I think that's what Iran wants. I'm not sure that Hamas wanted that. I think Hamas doesn't want to be wiped off the earth, which they probably will be and ought to be. But I think that Iran's hope was that Israel would have to go in incredibly strong into the Gaza Strip, and this would provide internal pressure in Saudi Arabia to prevent them from forming an alliance brokered by the Americans with the Israelis. I think that was probably the geopolitical reason for that. With that said, that does not mean that Israel has any other choice. Again, if suddenly 1,500 terrorists flooded into Great Britain and proceeded to murder 15 to 20,000 people, because again, Israel's a tiny, tiny country. It has 9 million people. If those numbers were made proportionate, if tens of thousands of people were slaughtered in Britain by a group of terrorists, I doubt that there would be a lot of British citizens who are sitting around worrying about proportionality or worrying about the geopolitical consequences of protecting their own citizenry.
There is an interesting contradiction, I would argue, that a lot of conservatives in America, a lot of Republicans have, including a number of presidential candidates from Ron DeSantis to Trump and others, they have signaled that they would want to severely curtail, if not stop altogether, support for Ukraine, and yet Ukraine was invaded by Russia. A lot of people slaughtered, continue to be slaughtered. Is there not a contradiction there that these Republicans would be full square behind Israel when it happens to them, but not full square behind Ukraine?
I mean, yes, there's a contradiction. It depends on sort of what is being said about Ukraine, and it runs the gamut. And some of the candidates that you've talked about have talked about ending aid completely to Ukraine. Some have talked about continuing aid to Ukraine and pursuing some sort of deal with the Russians that allows them to keep part of the Donbass and Crimea, which I think is a completely different story and is an actual off ramp. But yes, anybody who is sympathetic to Russia in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and then is sympathetic to Israel in this current conflict, that is a bizarre position to take. And again, I think that they're serious. America's a sovereign country. It has its own concerns that are not Israel's concerns, and it has its own concerns that are not Ukraine's concerns, and those don't always line up. But when it comes to a possible contradiction between a completely isolationist position on Ukraine and an interventionist position or a supportive position on Israel, of course, those things could clearly be in conflict. In my own position, by the way, for what it's worth, since as you know, Piers, I do this for a living, my own position on Ukraine has been that the United States should continue to supply Ukraine with the support necessary in order to preserve its government and to preserve its territory. And meanwhile, there need to be serious talks about what exactly an off-ramp looks like in Ukraine, because virtually no one has spelled out exactly what that looks like. And virtually no one believes at this point that Ukraine is going to be able to completely take back both the Donbass and the Crimea region. That is not
it's very
nearly the same
complicated.
thing as cut off funding
having
for
been
Ukraine.
to Ukraine and interviewed President Zelensky and met a lot of people there, and that was quite a while ago, there was an unbelievably steely resolve. And I would say the same resolve that Israel has about ceding any land now to the Palestinians. It's like they just don't want to give an inch of land away to the Russians. That was to a man and woman that I met out there.
I have an enormous amount of sympathy for that position. Again, that position does not necessarily dictate American policy any more than Israel's position with regard to, say, the so-called occupied territories, disputed territories, should necessarily dictate America's position on that. There are realistic consequences and concerns to be had on foreign policy. But if the point that you're making is that lack of moral support in an invasion of a sovereign country by Russia is in contradiction with moral support for Israel in this, I would say, yeah, I mean, there's certainly inconsistency there.
I mean, the other inconsistency and contradiction, it seems to me, is the reaction of the world when George Floyd was murdered, which was a despicable killing. And the police officer concerned is now serving a life sentence, quite rightly. But that sparked enormous global protests over America, over the UK, everywhere, with people marching in protest at what they perceived to be a racist murder of one person. And yet the reaction within hours of what happened here, where, as we knew at the time, nearly 1,000 people in Israel had been murdered, some in the most utterly horrific circumstances. The reaction was that, yes, there were big protests again, but they weren't really protests, they were marches of celebration. In America, in the UK, they marched down my local high street, celebrating what had happened, pro-Palestinian marches. I found that extraordinary.
Jew hatred is a very real thing. It's a very real thing. And we've obscured it with a lot of talk about Zionism and anti-Zionism, and we've obscured it with a lot of talk about geopolitics and context. But in the end, Jew hatred is quite real. And when you see crowds in Sydney chanting, "Gas the Jews," not free the occupied territories, not make a peace deal, gas the Jews, I'm not sure what we're supposed to read into that other than people mean what they say when they say gas the Jews.
Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly what they mean. I mean, this is Nazi language. I mean, but as you say, the difference between this and the Nazis tried to keep the secret, whereas this is all in plain sight. I mean, the idea of people doing this in cities like Sydney and London and New York, it's actually terrifying. And I say that again, I'm an Irish Catholic, I'm not Jewish. I feel terrified for Jewish people. Like you say, there's only 15 million Jewish people in the world. It must be, when this kind of thing happens in such an indiscriminate manner, it must be genuinely terrifying for people.
For sure. And obviously when you see marches of support, the question is always asked, how could the Holocaust have happened? And the answer is this way, when people are actively in favor of Jews being murdered simply for being Jews. And again, it's easy. People have an amazing ability to justify whatever it is that they're thinking or feeling at a given time. But if you can find a way to justify yourself out of the murder of babies in their cribs, I have a hard time figuring that it's anything other than Jew hatred. And so if, as a Jew, as a person who, is very strongly Jewish, I'm very active in my Jewish community, as a person with 4 kids and a wife and parents and sisters and all of this, obviously Jews feel like they are at risk everywhere because of this sort of activity. And I will say there's an amazing double standard when it comes to anti-Semitism and its treatment in the media. The way that it seems to work in the media these days is if somebody politically says something about George Soros, then they will be labeled a Nazi. And if somebody actually says I am a Nazi, then they will say, well, there's probably some sort of justification over territorial disputes.
Yeah. I want to end, Ben, on one positive note, and it's a montage we have of support for the Jewish people and for Israel. Let's take a look. So, Ben, that last image was of the Brandenburg Gate, which, of course, we saw back in the 30s with Nazi swastikas all over it. And today the Israel flag is emblazoned across it proudly and supportively. I mean, amid all the Jew hating, and you're right, that's what it is, there's also been an amazing outpouring of support.
And that is incredible. And we who are Jews obviously appreciate that. And I would just like to say at the very end here that must be translated into allowing Israel to do what must be done to protect her own citizenry, because goodwill only goes so far as the actual protection of human lives. And if the Jews were to rely on the goodwill of the world over the course of history, it would have gone very poorly for them. That's why the state of Israel exists. It exists so that never again is never again. And in order for that to be a reality, the IDF, the state of Israel, has to be able to defend itself, has to be able to defend its citizenry and protect them from the kind of slaughter and savagery that we saw over the weekend.
Ben Shapiro, thank you very much indeed for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thank you.